You think you're dreaming, but you're remembering. Not events, not facts, but truths. The kind that couldn't be named in daylight. The kind that had no place at the dinner table. The kind that, when spoken as a child, were met with silence, or worse, with a smile that meant forget. But the unconscious never forgets. It stores what the ego cannot bear. It records every wound that was dismissed, every feeling that had to be amputated so the body could stay in the room. And at night, when the sensors grow tired, when the narrative disintegrates, when the facade rests, the truth returns. Disguised, distorted, dramatized. Yes, but always intact. You're not dreaming. You're remembering in the only language left to you. Image, symbol, repetition. The falling, the chasing, the lover who never turns around, the child locked outside, the scream you can't produce, the house you always return to. These are not fantasies. They are returns. Returns to the moment where you split in half, where your body went one way and your truth another. Returns to the psychic threshold where your feelings were no longer safe to name. And so you built defenses. You learned to call pain maturity. You renamed longing independence. You turned dissociation into functionality. But the psyche never bought it. The psyche remembered, and it continued to speak in your symptoms, in your cravings, in your dreams. Because repression is not deletion. It is deferral, and the bill always arrives. At night, the doors open. The repressed returns not as history, but as repetition. You relive the betrayal in disguise. You rewrite the abandonment with new characters. You restage the loss so that this time, maybe it can be born. This is not dysfunction. This is a psychic economy that refuses waste. Even your neurosis is efficient. It builds with scraps. It constructs survival with what little you were allowed to keep. And the dream, that strange theater where logic collapses, is where your soul performs its residue. But you don't listen. You wake. You dismiss. You call it nonsense. You Google symbols. You turn it into metaphor before you let it be memory. Because facing what it means would tear a hole in your coherence. And you need to function. You need to get to work. You need to smile, eat, produce. There is no time to unravel, but the unraveling has already begun. The dream is the proof. You're not dreaming. You're leaking. The unconscious is seeping into the cracks. It has waited long enough. It no longer wants silence. It wants witness. And so it brings you back to the closet where you first learned to hide, to the hallway where your footsteps were too loud, to the bed where love and fear came dressed in the same touch, to the room where you wanted something and were told it was too much. You dream of him, of her, of it, but it is never about them. It is about you, not the you perform, the you that was buried beneath survival, the you that still lives in shadow. Because healing is not transcendence. It is excavation. It is not escaping the unconscious. It is becoming conscious of it. To know what moves you. To recognize the phantom hand behind your choices. To see that your patterns are not accidental, they are expressions. Every compulsion, a disguised wish. Every trigger, a forgotten wound. Every dream, a coded letter from the part of you that remembers what your ego denies. This is not mysticism. This is the mind obeying its own laws. Laws older than your personality. Laws forged in conflict between what you wanted and what was allowed. The child wanted. The child burned. The child reached and was met with shame or neglect or confusion. And the psyche responded, split the feeling, bury the image, tell another story, but never want that way again. And now you dream of the wanting, of the original crime not against others, but against yourself. The crime of self-abandonment, dressed as adaptation, and you call this adulthood. But inside, the child waits. Inside, the forbidden lives on not as memory, but as dream. And you ask, why am I so tired? Why do I sabotage what I say I want? Why do I keep ending up here? And the answer comes not in language, but in image. A locked room, a bleeding hand, a mother with no face, a voice off stage, whispering your name, but using the one no one calls you anymore. You are not dreaming. You are remembering what your body still holds. You are remembering what your speech cannot carry. You are remembering the truths that once endangered your belonging. But belonging built on suppression is exile in disguise. You sleep beside people who do not know you. You wake in lives you did not choose. You work jobs that mute you. You make love with the brakes on. You call this normal, and your dreams call it what it is. Repetition, compromise, a life carefully curated to avoid re-experiencing pain, and in doing so, re-experiencing nothing at all. And so the dream returns, not to torment, to reintroduce you to your original hunger, to your ungrieved losses, to your distorted desires, to the self that still breathes beneath the performance. Let us now turn briefly to the psychoanalytic understanding of dreams, as Freud would frame it. The individual experiencing recurrent dreams is not suffering from a flaw in constitution, but rather from an internal division produced by repression. The dream, as I have demonstrated, is the disguised fulfillment of a repressed wish. It offers neither comfort nor clarity, but rather presents fragments of latent content through symbolic distortion. To the analyst, the dream is not a bridge in the poetic sense, but a psychic formation shaped by the conflict between unconscious drives and the censorship imposed by the ego. Its function is not to soothe, but to reveal obliquely the repressed material the conscious mind cannot tolerate in its unmediated form. And the question is not whether you dream. The question is, will you look? Will you let the image become word? Will you let the word become feeling? Will you stop calling your own story nonsense? Because it matters. It has always mattered, and no one can remember it but you. Fade to black. A single door opens. The viewer sees only the threshold. The voice softens, but deepens. The descent continues. We continue now past the threshold of dreams and into the silent architecture of repression. The monologue deepens. The pace slows. We move from the symbols of sleep into the structures of waking life, where the ego maintains order by dividing the self, and the cost of that order begins to show. You live by day what you forget at night. You wake into a self you mistake for freedom, but it is design. The design of the ego, precise, necessary, ruthless. It protects you, but it also narrows you. Because to survive the contradictions of feeling, you had to build walls, not with stone, but with silence. You call it personality, but it is not who you are. It is who you became to manage what you could not metabolize. You rehearse your roles with skill. You become dependable, desired, efficient, admired, and slowly, almost elegantly, you vanish. Not completely, not obviously. You smile, you succeed, you endure, but the core, the part that longs, that rages, that breaks, is nowhere to be seen. This is repression, not forgetting structuring, a system of inner censorship, 1,000 tiny no's delivered every day, until the yes inside you goes silent. You don't say, I am afraid to want. You say, I'm fine. You don't say, touch feels like threat. You say, I'm just not affectionate. You don't say, I'm lonely. You say, I'm just really independent. This is how repression sounds. Not loud, not tragic, polite, rational, functional, and beneath it, the return of what was once refused. It returns not as memory, but as symptom. The anxiety that has no clear source. The exhaustion that no sleep relieves. The attraction to what wounds you. The numbness that grows louder with every achievement. From this emotional landscape, we now descend into the clinical logic of symptoms, viewed through the Freudian lens. Symptoms, as I have posited, are the result of repressed material attempting to return to consciousness, albeit in a disguised form. They are not arbitrary manifestations, but compromised formations, the outcome of an internal conflict between unconscious drives and the ego's mechanisms of defense. The patient, having been conditioned by societal norms, is more often attuned to suppression than to interpretation. Thus, rather than engaging with the latent meaning of the symptom, the individual tends toward repression, resistance, or sublimation. And so you fight your symptoms like enemies. You silence them with performance. You drown them in wellness rituals. You decorate your pain with self-improvement. But the unconscious does not respond to punishment. It responds to presence, to curiosity, to the simple, terrifying act of sitting with what hurts and not trying to fix it. Because most of your life was not designed for truth. It was designed for containment. You contain your rage so others feel safe. You contain your desire so you remain lovable. You contain your grief so no one has to witness it. And then you wonder why your body clenches, why your chest tightens, why you can't breathe fully, why you dream of rooms you can't leave. Repression is not absence. It is imprisonment, a psychic pact. I will hide this from myself so I can be loved. I will disown my need so I can stay in the room. I will amputate part of me if it guarantees I won't be abandoned. And part of you agreed, because at the time there was no other choice. But now, the cost is too high. You forget what you gave up, but your symptoms remember. Your fantasies remember. Your relationships remember. The way you fear closeness. The way you sabotage peace. The way you stay busy so you don't have to feel. These are not character flaws. They are defense mechanisms made visible. Your unconscious is loyal, not to your happiness, but to your survival. And so it protects you from knowing what it thinks would break you. But what if you're ready now? What if the part of you that split is calling for reintegration? What if the thing you fear to feel is the key to your return? The return of your voice, the return of your will, the return of the unspoken sentence. I remember now. This is not healing in the spiritual sense. This is reassembly of parts, of memory, of psychic coherence. Not becoming new, but becoming whole enough to hold what once had to be buried. To say, yes, I wanted that. To say, yes, I hated that. To say, yes, I needed more than they could give me. To say, yes, I still feel all of it and it no longer terrifies me. Because the unconscious is not against you. It is not chaos. It is wisdom in disguise. And every repression, when understood, becomes a map, a guide, a door. You have not been asleep. You've been rehearsing safety. And now, the rehearsal is ending. You will not be perfect. You will not be pure. But you will be present. And that is what makes you alive again. The image returns. The closed door. But now, the viewer sees it from the other side. It is unlocked. The handle waits. The voice slows, but does not stop. We move now into the corridors of fantasy where the psyche seeks refuge, disguise, and expression when reality becomes unbearable. This is the terrain where instinct meets inhibition, where the unacceptable is lived in symbolic form, and where desire, distorted by repression, continues to pulse beneath the surface of the so-called normal. You do not fantasize for pleasure. You fantasize for contact, because something in you still wants what you once had to forfeit. And the fantasy, that soft distortion of memory and wish, becomes the only place where your longing is permitted to breathe. Do not confuse fantasy with fiction. It is not made up. It is made safe. It is the return of what could not be tolerated in raw form, restructured into symbols, stories, scenes. Likewise, the content of our fantasies, often dismissed or pathologized, must be reconsidered in psychoanalysis. Fantasy, in the psychoanalytic sense, represents a compromise formation, a construction generated by the ego to manage the demands of the id that cannot be gratified in external reality. These fantasies persist not due to pathology, but due to the enduring strength of repressed libidinal drives. They serve as a substitute for action, allowing instinctual energy to find expression in a distorted symbolic form. The content of such fantasies often reflects unresolved internal conflicts, particularly those arising during early psychosexual development. Thus, fantasy is neither accident nor error, but an inevitable psychic product of repression and the reality principle. The erotic fantasy, the revenge fantasy, the rescue fantasy, the humiliation, the control, the ideal lover, the collapse, all of it coded, not in the language of reason, but in the logic of the unconscious. You want to be wanted. You want to be punished. You want to disappear. You want to be seen so completely that your shame burns away. And then you wake. You judge. You call it inappropriate. You call it deviant. You call it just imagination. But there is no just in fantasy. It is your mind trying to make meaning out of tension between what you feel and what you are allowed to feel, between what you are and what you were told to be. The drive does not disappear. It redirects. Sexuality becomes work. Aggression becomes perfectionism. Tenderness becomes sarcasm. Need becomes withdrawal. And yet the original tension remains. The pressure builds, and the psyche, desperate for release, dreams. Fantasy is symptom, but it is also intelligence. It shows you where the conflict lives. It shows you what the ego fears. It shows you what the body wants to confess, but cannot say aloud. But you must be careful, not because fantasy is dangerous, but because it is seductive. You may come to live there. You may come to prefer it, because in fantasy, there is no contradiction. In fantasy, you control the gaze. You control the outcome. You write the scene where no one ever turns away. But it is not real. It is symbolic compensation for real loss. And it cannot replace what was never received. It can only signal its absence. You fantasize about being wanted, not because you are greedy, but because the absence of that want once shaped your entire sense of worth. You fantasize about being dominated, not because you are weak, but because surrender in your history was never safe enough to choose. You fantasize about running away, not because you're immature, but because your nervous system has not yet known what it feels like to stay. Fantasy is not the problem, but when fantasy is mistaken for fulfillment, it becomes the prison, because no one can give you what your fantasy offers. No one can be your psychic caretaker. No one can rescue the child you once were. That work, that impossible, sacred work, belongs to you. This is where analysis begins, with the question, what does this fantasy preserve? What pain does it try to avoid? What self does it protect? And then, beyond all of that, what truth is it pointing toward that I have not yet dared to live? Because you are not what you fantasize. You are what you fear to feel. And beneath the scenes you replay again and again is a wound. And inside that wound is the original story. The one that never ended. The one you've been trying to rewrite ever since. But the rewriting won't come through escape. It comes through confrontation, through tracing the desire to its source, through sitting with the wish and asking, what part of me is still waiting for a different ending? You may never get that ending, but you can offer what the fantasy can't. Presence. You can stop abandoning the part of you that still waits. You can witness the wish without collapsing into it. You can hold the contradiction and stay. This is not the erasure of fantasy. It is its evolution. You begin to live with your desires, not through them. You stop being acted by them and begin to act with them, consciously, humanly, imperfectly. The symptom begins to loosen, not because it has been suppressed, but because it has been seen. And what has been seen can be held, and what is held no longer needs to scream. We go further now into the core formation of neurosis, where instinct and inhibition collide, where the drives push against the walls of culture, morality, memory, where the price of belonging becomes internal conflict, and the human subject, caught between demand and desire, begins to fracture with dignity. Neurosis is not weakness. It is architecture, an internal compromise between what the body wants and what the world forbids, between the primal and the permissible, between the instinct to act and the terror of consequence. You did not invent this conflict. You inherited it from language, from law, from your mother's disappointment, your father's silence, the schoolyard rule that punish touch, punish truth, punish tears. To survive, you learn to divide, to separate drive from expression, to push the instinct underground and build a false self on top of it. A self that follows rules, that earns love, that doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. And it worked. You became acceptable. But the drives didn't vanish. They mutated into symptoms, into tension, into repetition. Neurosis is the symptom of an unbearable decision made long ago. To be loved, I must exile a part of myself. The body remembers the exile, and it protests with migraines, with insomnia, with compulsions and obsessions, with the silent violence of self-abandonment. You don't know why you say yes when you mean no, why you feel guilt when you rest, why love suffocates you, why success tastes like ash, why your joy is always followed by shame. You think this is personal. You think something is wrong with you. But this is not about personal failure. This is the structure of civilization, where desire must be regulated to preserve order, and where the cost of order is often the self. You internalize the voice of prohibition. You call it conscience. You call it discipline. But it is older than your choices. It is the voice of the superego, formed not from moral clarity, but from fear of exclusion. The superego does not guide. It attacks. It punishes you for wanting. It shames you for needing. It whispers that your instincts will ruin you, and then waits for proof. It is not God. It is your history, projected inward, and under its gaze, you learn to live small. You become loyal to guilt. You feel safe only in struggle. You mistake inner conflict for virtue. But guilt is not always ethical. Sometimes, guilt is a remnant of oppression, a scar from years of contorting your being into a shape that kept others comfortable. You are not guilty for wanting. You are not guilty for resting. You are not guilty for choosing peace over performance. The guilt you feel is not a signal of wrongdoing. It is the nervous system's echo of past punishment, and you can learn slowly to hear it without obeying it. To say, yes, I feel guilt, and I will not retreat. To say, yes, I feel shame, and I will not split. To say, yes, I feel fear, and I will not forget myself again. Because the self is not a fixed identity. It is an ongoing negotiation, a fragile alliance between your drives and your demands, between what you were taught and what you remember in your bones. You will never be free of contradiction, but you can become fluent in it. This is what it means to individuate, not to transcend your neurosis, but to integrate it, to take the symptom into your arms and say, I know why you came. I know what you were protecting. This is not cure. This is clarity. This is the point at which you stop punishing your pain and start learning its language. You begin to live not to avoid suffering, but to suffer on purpose, to suffer with truth. And in that truth, something shifts. The symptom softens. The shame loosens. The old story grows quiet. You do not become happy. You become real, not functional, human. Now we move into the most subtle layer of all the moral terrain of the inner world. Here, the superego reigns not with reason, but with cruelty. It whispers not "do better," but "you are not enough." It is the internalization of a gaze that was never kind. We move now into the ethics of the unconscious, into the painful cost of internal obedience, and the long, deliberate labor of reclaiming authority over one's own soul. This brings us to a deeper moral structure, the superego. Freud described it as follows. The individual often mistakes the superego as psychic agency formed through the internalization of parental and societal prohibitions for an absolute moral authority. This structure, however, does not necessarily reflect objective ethics, but rather the historical contingencies of early childhood impressions. It operates through judgment and punishment, frequently manifesting as irrational guilt or self-reproach. In such cases, what is perceived as conscience is, in fact, a reiteration of early prohibitive identifications, echoing a structure you absorbed when you were too young to question. The superego does not ask you to be good. It demands that you never be too much. It sets impossible standards, then mocks you for failing. It convinces you that suffering makes you worthy, that silence is strength, that guilt is proof of virtue. But guilt is not always a guide. Sometimes guilt is a ghost, a haunting left behind by other people's limits. You feel guilt for resting. You feel guilt for needing. You feel guilt for simply existing outside the frame you were shaped to fit. This is not ethics. This is entrapment. You are not bad for wanting peace. You are not selfish for turning inward. You are not broken for refusing to perform pain for the comfort of others. The superego is not your moral compass. It is your internalized fear of rejection dressed in the language of duty. You ask, am I allowed to live differently? But you're not waiting for permission from others. You're waiting for the permission you still deny yourself. Because somewhere inside, you still believe that freedom must be earned with suffering. That joy must be negotiated with guilt. That if you stop striving, you will cease to exist. But you don't exist because you strive. You exist because you feel. And feeling is not weakness. Feeling is contact. Feeling is what makes the unconscious conscious. But you were taught to fear feeling because feeling made you visible, and being visible made you vulnerable. So you learned to protect yourself with control. You learned to survive by predicting everyone's expectations and becoming exactly what they needed you to be. And it worked until it didn't. Until you realized that a life built on pleasing others is a life built on the denial of your own center. This is not rebellion. This is return. Return to the self before it was cut into pieces for acceptance. Return to the part of you that still knows the difference between duty and distortion. Return to the part of you that still aches not because you're wrong, but because you're real. Living with the unconscious awake means you can no longer pretend. You can no longer pretend that obedience is the same as love. You can no longer pretend that suffering is sacred. You can no longer pretend that silence is maturity. The truth is, your pain has a shape, and that shape was formed by history, by family, by silence, by shame. It is not unique, and that's what makes it sacred. Because what is not unique is what binds us. You begin to realize that your most personal wounds were never just yours. They are woven into the social fabric. They are stitched into the laws of belonging. And so, healing is not personal either. It is ethical. To live without self-denial is to reject a world that profits from your silence. To feel without shame is to confront generations of repression. To speak truthfully is to break an ancient spell. But this is not glamour. This is risk. Because truth alienates. Truth shatters comfort. Truth draws a line that cannot be uncrossed. You will lose some things. The false peace, the applause, the mask that made others feel safe. And you will grieve, not just for what you lost, but for how long you lived without yourself. But then, something else appears. Quiet, small at first, but unmistakably alive. A sense of inner authority. Not arrogance, not dominance, but the calm recognition. I am no longer living according to someone else's fear. You begin to ask new questions. Not, how should I feel? But, what do I know? Not, what will they think? But, what do I refuse to abandon this time? This is the ethical life. Not a life without mistakes, but a life without self-erasure. To carry your unconscious with awareness, to let it shape you, speak through you, without letting it rule you blindly. To be in dialogue with your shadow, to know your projections, to own your hunger, to stop outsourcing your morality to the voice that taught you how to shrink. You are not here to be a saint. You are here to be whole. And that means walking the thin line between instinct and integrity, between desire and discipline, between guilt that belongs to you and guilt that never did. You don't owe the world your self-destruction. You owe it your presence. That is the new ethic. To live awake, to live without performance, to live with contradiction, and still choose not to abandon your center. We enter the final arc now. The return. Not a return to what was, but a return to what is the self, reclaimed from its disguises. No catharsis, no climax, just the steady weight of knowing. The slow integration of everything the unconscious has revealed. This is where the work begins. Not in insight, but in living it. You do not emerge from the unconscious, triumphant. You emerge disoriented, softer, less certain, not enlightened but honest. You no longer seek purity. You no longer perform insight. You carry what you've seen, and you live in its shadow with a kind of quiet fidelity. You have not solved your pain. You've stopped lying about it. You've stopped dressing it in achievement. You've stopped offering it up to people who never asked to know you. You've stopped making it perform. And as we near the end of this exploration, it is worth remembering what Freud emphasized about transformation. The analytic process does not aim at a state of so-called healing in the romantic sense, but at a more conscious relationship between the ego and the repressed elements within the psyche. Rather than eliminating conflict, psychoanalysis seeks to render the unconscious conscious, to allow the subject to confront psychic reality without the distortions of defense. In doing so, the individual does not attain coherence in a totalizing sense, but rather an increased capacity to tolerate ambiguity and contradiction within the self. This is not what people expect when they speak of transformation. They expect joy, certainty, a new name, But what you have now is less dramatic and more enduring. You have a self that no longer flees. You get up in the morning and you don't ask, how do I become better? You ask, how do I remain in contact? You begin to speak less, not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer need to convince anyone. You forgive yourself more easily, not because it didn't matter, but because you know now why you did it. You lose interest in performance. You are no longer seduced by the identity that saved you. You grieve it. You thank it. And then you let it go. You begin to feel the shape of your boundaries, not as walls, but as skin, something living, sensitive, responsive. You say no earlier. You say yes slower. You do not explain your silences. You do not apologize for what no longer fits. You walk differently now, not because you are proud, but because you are rooted, because the ground beneath you is your own body, your own memory, your own truth, unearthed. You stop needing to be seen by everyone. You stop seeking witnesses because you have become your own. You live in the awareness that no one is coming to save you, and this no longer frightens you. It steadies you. You become less interested in being understood, more interested in being real, even if it means being misunderstood, even if it means walking away, even if it means standing in the quiet aftermath of authenticity alone. But even there, especially there, you are not without ground. You are with yourself. And that is not a slogan. It is a labor, the daily labor of not betraying what you now know. You still make mistakes. You still regress. You still find yourself in old rooms with old fears, wearing the old mask. But now you notice. Now you name it. And naming that smallest gesture breaks the spell, because awareness is an act of resistance. And every time you choose it, the self reconstitutes itself from the fragments. You are not new. You are gathered, not clean, but coherent. And that coherence, the quiet intimacy between you and your contradictions, that is what makes you human and what makes you free. This is how you return from the unconscious, not by rising above it, but by walking with it, not by transcending the pain, but by integrating it into the rhythm of your breath. You do not become untouched. You become unfalsified. And that is what dignity looks like in the psychoanalytic sense. To carry your truth and not place it in the hands of the world for safekeeping. To live without needing to be witnessed. To feel that you are real. To suffer with meaning. To love with edges. To speak with weight. To dream not to escape, but to remember what still wants to live. And now, you know, not everything, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to stop lying to yourself. Enough to stop asking others to carry what you abandoned in yourself. Enough to stop seeking salvation in distraction, in performance, in endless self-improvement. You do not need to become someone else. You need to become someone real. You've traveled through the ruins, the dream work, the drives, the defense, the wound, the mask. You've seen the original fracture, where wanting met punishment, where the psyche split to survive. And still, you're here, still breathing, still listening, still able to choose contact over control, presence over performance, truth over peace. This is not transcendence. This is not healing as the world sells it. This is fidelity to the parts of yourself that were once made to disappear. And now you do not disappear. You remain. You remain when it hurts. You remain when the guilt rises. You remain when your history repeats itself in a lover's mouth. You remain, not because it is easy, but because vanishing costs too much. You've learned to live in contradiction, to carry the child and the adult, the rage and the tenderness, the broken wish and the life you chose instead. You have learned to live with your unconscious, not as a curse, but as a companion. You no longer need every symptom to vanish. You don't panic when the dream returns. You don't flinch when grief arrives unannounced. You know the terrain now. You know that descent is not defeat. It is maintenance. This is what it means to be truly alive, to feel the pulse of your history without letting it write your future. And so you rise, not above yourself, but into yourself. No applause, no miracle, just the quiet, continuous decision. I will not abandon myself today. You are not whole, but you are no longer hiding. And sometimes that is the most radical thing a person can do. So when the dreams come tonight, and they will do not run, open the door, sit with what returns, and say the words no one ever said to you. You don't have to be exiled here anymore. I'm staying. That is the end of forgetting. That is the beginning of a life that is yours.